So we just talked about the Details tab, the Cropping tab, Lens Correction in Capture One. But one of the tools we haven't talked about yet is going to be the Adjust in Brush tab. Now this tab is masking basically with the power of healing and cloning. The reason I like this is because, like we talked about in the color editor section, where we had some of the problems with the redhead model, where we tried to select the specific tone of just the skin, but because she's a redhead model, what happens is the tones in the hair are very similar to the skin. So what did we have to do? We had to use a uniformity, take it into Photoshop and mask it in. Although it works, and it works very well, I want to show you how to mask it in Capture One as well, because it has the same kind of features available to you. So here we have one of Gary Martin's images, which is a headshot, and it's a good variety to keep because we want to cater to pretty much any photographer that uses this program and show you the versatility that no matter what you shoot, you can use the program. Now, when we go into this local adjustment brush tab, the first thing that happens is, number one, I need to go back and double check that I have my arrow key and not the spot removal brush, because that was from the last section. Whenever I click this, it goes back here. Now the intention of this is specifically if you know what you want to do. It's not for every single image, it's not for every purpose, but it's specifically for adjusting areas that are local, not global. It's not to adjust everything, but maybe if you have a lot of light fall off, you can fix that. You can do that because of masking. If you want to do any healing work or cloning work, which is Photoshop related, you do that here as well, and it keeps it non-destructive. I'll show you an example of everything. So first we have our image here. We've already selected, and I just imported it into our regular catalog. I will zoom in so we can get a good look of our subject. And I will bring it down. Now let's pretend, for instance, that we feel that we want to bring up some of this exposure just on his face and not every part of the shadow. What we'd have to do first is we need to create a new layer. So we will come down here and select New Layer. We'll name this layer Shadow Adjustment. This is for the purpose of showcasing how this works, not that I would do this on every image, okay? So once we've selected a new layer, we want to tell the program what we want to do. So we can say, let's up the exposure. The difference here is that when we start adjusting the exposure, it's not going to show just yet because the layer itself is masked out. It's black if you imagine in Photoshop standards, because by default it's completely covered. It's waiting for our brush to start brushing. So I like to think of it in this way. This exposure or any adjustment that we do right now on a new layer is basically changing the parameters of the brush itself. So we are loading the brush with light, if you think of it that way. So first thing first, I want to load a higher exposure to the brush. So when we do start brushing, it's going to paint this exact exposure amount. So I'll load this, let's say 2. Next, after we've loaded the brush, we are going to start drawing on the image itself. Now we'll first click on the brush tool to activate it, and then we'll come over here next to it where the slider is, and this is going to be our cursor tool settings. This cursor tool settings shows my size of my brush. You can see the size of the brush, the hardness, meaning how soft the brush is or how abrupt it is. I keep it to 0 because I think a softer brush is better, and the flow. And the flow is basically how fast the buildup starts happening as we brush. It's like a gentle brush. So I'm going to keep it, say, let's say about 5 or 6, okay? And that's it. I will turn that off. Before I start brushing, make sure that under this tool here, if you push down on the brush, it says never display mask, make sure that is the only thing that is checked aside from draw mask, okay? And the shortcut for that is M, so you can go between display mask and draw mask. If I hit display mask, what will happen is when I start brushing, it's going to show red. And I personally don't like that because it interferes with my results. Let's just go ahead and show you. So never display mask. And then when I bring my brush size down, I can do that with a keyboard shortcut. And on mine, it's the bracket keys on the right-hand side of the keyboard. But for you, it may be in a different location. And you can find that under our keyboard shortcut settings that allow you to do so. Or you can change the brush size here as well. Okay? Now I will select the brush size that is most useful for me, and I'll start brushing. And as I start brushing, you notice that it starts painting in a higher exposure to that specific area. How do I know this? Well, two ways. If I go back to this brush icon and select always display mask, you see that redness that starts painting across his face. Well, it's not an actual color, it's just a mask. It's just showing you that's where we've painted. You can see why I don't like it very much because I don't want a red cast on his face. So I'll say never display mask. The other way to tell is if I turn this shadow layer on and off, it works just like Photoshop where I can turn on and off the layer. If I want to reduce the intensity, I can go erase mask, change my parameters again, making sure my opacity is 100, my flow is low, and then just start brushing, and then erase. The shortcuts are located here. B is draw mask, E is erase. So something to keep in mind. So you can do that with exposure, right? But what else can you do? Well, very simply put, you could do white balance. So I can say, let's do a new layer and say white balance. I can load my brush again. Let's say I'm going to do a white balance that's crazy, just for illustration effect. I can hit B, which is draw mask. The settings are the same. I'll change this, and I'll say, let's change the white balance of his face. And as I start brushing, you see it gets a lot warmer because we've changed the white balance. You can also change the white balance after you brush. So once I brush, I can change the parameters. I go, well, you know what? I think I prefer a white balance that's cooler. Let's go over here. And I think that actually fits because if I go back to shot, it's a little warm and I can cool it down, I can warm it up, whatever it is. So you could do that with white balance, you could do it with exposure. And if you take a look here, these tools are everything we talked about earlier in our color and exposure tab. So I can undo that if I want to. I can minimize that. I can minimize exposure. I can then even do it with dynamic range. I can say, let's bring up the shadows. Actually, no. Let's add a new layer. Let's bring up the shadows on this layer. I go back to my brush tool, and then when I start brushing, only the shadows start coming up. And I know this because I can uncheck and check, and it just brings up just the shadows, which I could also do to the side of his face. If I want to flatten it out, I can do that, but obviously you don't, so you can take that off. And the same thing for the tie. If I decide that, you know what, I just want it to the tie, I can take the erase brush. I can erase all that work we did to the side of his face because it was terrible, and I'm not proud of myself for this. And then just quickly switch over to B, which is my brush. Spacebar, drag down, change brush size, and paint on the tie. And just the shadows on the tie come back. It's almost like I manually tried to mask it out. So there you have it. It brings that back. And again, I would use my Wacom tablet typically for this, but just to give you an example of how it works, regardless of what you're using. Next, it also applies with a curve. It has my Luma curve, but I don't really, do too much. I could apply sharpening to specific areas. This is handy where if you decide that, you know what, I'm going to take this shot here and add a layer called this sharpening for eyes. I will increase the sharpening for eyes. I'll take my brush. I will change my brush size. And then if I start brushing, and maybe do the eyebrows as well, you notice that if I turn this on and off, the sharpening comes into effect. I can do for clarity as well, noise reduction, moire, and the biggest factor is I could do it to the color editor. This is where I was talking earlier about masking the color editor. Now, let me show you specifically what this is in reference to. So let's say I come back here to this image that we were struggling with. I can now go back to my adjustment brush, go to my skin tone. Let's load the brush up with the ability to make a really great even skin. Come to my color editor and sample a skin tone that I like. If I bring my hue uniformity, I bring the hue over, maybe a little bit of saturation, and then I'll go back to my local adjustment, click on the brush, and then as I start brushing, let me change my flow to 100 just for effect, because I did a really gradual setting here. And I turn that on and off. I go back to my color editor. Let's shift the uniformity here. So if I turn this on and off, you see that all the skin actually became that specific shade that I selected. If I decide that, oh, wait a second, I picked the wrong skin tone, it's really easy to undo. I can go back to my color editor, just take my color picker again, and pick the nice one, which was on the forehead. And instantly, the skin itself became even. I didn't have to do anything with the hair. I didn't take it into Photoshop. It was just the skin. And if I want to take it further, I'll go back to my brush. I can click the brush here as well on top if I don't want to go back to this little tab. And just be like, you know what, let's fix the chin too. Done. I can say, you know what, some of the sides here need to be fixed as well. And this was shot by one of my good friends, Jonas Jensen. He is a great beauty photographer. We were on set together with Phase One doing this image, which is why it was so fascinating to take full potential of the program and really get a sense of how this works. We can even do the same thing for the hair. If we're like, you know what, I think I want this hair to be closer to the top of the hair, I could do that as well. I'll go to my local adjustment, new layer, even hair. I'll go to my color editor. I will pick the hair color that I like. I will then use a uniformity and go all the way for now. Come back to my brush, change my brush size, and start brushing. And take a look at that. Everywhere that I brush, it's going to match that color that I want it to be more uniform. And just like magic, I'm able to change and shift different hues. I can also shift the lightness of it. So if I want to bring down the lightness of it because it's too bright, I can do that, make it a little bit darker. And even change the saturation. Maybe it's too saturated, less saturated. Change the hue, all after the fact. So I can brush it in first and then change it. So this is where a Wacom tablet is very useful, and one that I would usually use is just change that. Maybe add the brush setting to my Wacom shortcuts, and that way I can brush in camera raw. Obviously, this is just up to the client. This is up to you, personal preference on, what you think should happen. but I'm just going to complete this area here because I don't like leaving things half done. I want them to look good. And even with the trackpad, I'm going to make it happen because that's what we do, make things happen. So there you go. Let me go back up here to my layers, turn that off. And you can, tone that down if you wanted to. Just go to erase with the E. If you don't see the brush itself, if it looks like this, it's because you're too zoomed out or it's too small at that viewing distance. If you zoom in, it gets bigger like that. So that's pretty cool. Another cool thing you can do is if you feel like there's light spillage in by accident, and it wasn't, but just saying if it was, I can say reduce light spill. And with reduced light spill, I can go into the color tab here, again, skin tone. And because we're on a new layer, I can optimize another skin tone layer. Because over here in the skin tone, in the color adjustment tab, on the color editor, I can only do one. There's no layering. So that is also why I think this is an awesome area, because I can cheat and keep adding new layers and add more color editor skin tone tabs and cheat that way, which is awesome. So that's my favorite. So let's say I do reduce light spillage. I do exposure, minus exposure here. Take my my brush tool, change the brush size. Change my flow. Let's see here. My flow will go down again. And then as we brush, it fixes the light spillage. And this is why I recommend a low flow, because without the low flow, you ain't going nowhere. I should say you're going to go all the way without having that control. So there we go. Reduce light spillage. And even with a trackpad, it looks pretty good. I can bring up the light here if I wanted to. I can bring down the exposure here. I can say, actually, you know what? I'm going to keep it the same layer as the first one, because it's just the negative exposure. So I'll just, there. So quickly, I'll just undo these. So you can see where we started with. We started with that. We even the skin, we even the hair a little bit. We adjust the light spillage, and this one was blank, so I'll minus that. Another thing that you can do, if you want to do the inverse, where you add a layer, and this layer, let's say we do exposure up, so we're going to get increased exposure. But you know how normally, if you bring this exposure up, it just loads the brush. It's not doing anything to repaint. If you want to do the opposite, I can click on the layer itself, right click, I can say invert mask. So if I invert mask, what tends to happen is now when I adjust this, it's going to make it so that it starts by applying it everywhere, and then I have to use my eraser just to erase the areas that I don't want it applied to. So it's the inverted effect, which I don't like doing, obviously, because if you're doing local adjustments, then you're only doing adjustments to one specific area. But the advantage is you can do, for example, multiple skin tone tabs in many layers if you know what you want globally. So that's an added benefit. But since I'm not doing that, I'll just delete that, exposure up. And then again, it does it for any fringing. The same thing happens for any of these images here. So let's say that we select this one. I'll select new layer, even skin. Then I'll go down to B for brush, color editor, skin tone. I'll pick skin that I like. I like this little beige neutral tab. Uniformity is going to come down up here. And then once everything is uniform, I will select my brush. brush, and then I'll start brushing. And because it's already picking the skin tone itself and not the background and everything else, it's already doing like this, rough mask for me. The only difference is now it's also picking the lipstick. So because we're masking, I can go to eraser. I can just bring down my size of the brush itself. I can just brush over the lips and simply mask that out. So it's not affecting the lips or the eyes. I can quickly go in, change the flow. Let's bring that to 100 real quick. So we have just a quick shift. And maybe even the hair, because I think the hair is a little bit affected by it maybe. No, not so much. Perfect. So let's turn that layer on and off. So you can see the red fingers disappear. Let's zoom in there because this is pretty important. So you can see the actual red in the skin is subsided. If you want to tone that back down, just go back into the color editor, bring the uniformity, and bring back a little bit of the naturalness depending on how natural you want it. Or even better, you can bring back a little bit of naturalness in the tone and make the saturation even. So in case the red was already saturated, you can tone that down or bring it back. So you can see that even though it's becoming more uniform, the saturation is still very bright in the fingers, so we'll just do that and it'll match whatever tone we selected. So there, we have the best of both worlds. We have a little bit of red still there, we fix the saturation altogether, and now everything on the skin is more uniform. And even the face and everything else, because we masked it in, if I turn it on and off, let's look at it. On, this is off. So you see the different shades of green, beige, red, so on and so forth. And then if we click on even skin, everything's more uniform, and we can tone it up or down just based on how far we're going to push it. Again, if you want to push it really far, just bring up the hue, and then it goes all the way and makes everything ultra perfect, which I think it can be great depending on what you're looking for. So I turn that off. You'll notice just how green that neck was. Now it's that nice beige color that we decided we wanted, which is amazing, right? That's pretty cool. I didn't even know it was green. I mean, if I had hovered over this and looked at my numbers, you'd see how green that is, But if I then turn it on and then hover over, it looks a lot better. So that's an advantage of combining that color editor and masking, which I think is just great. And one other example is the same thing goes for these other images. Let's say, for fun, that we like to fix this, where she has some redder, more red, redder, more red, whatever you want to use, hands. But it is it's not hitting the focus plane, I think. So let's actually select this particular image where we have a lot of variance happening. Again, local brush. We will go into the color editor first, but because we're in the masking section, we will just select a good skin tone that we like. We will then adjust, not the hue, the uniformity a bit like this, and as well as the saturation, because I see the hands are a little bit desaturated and red at the same time, so this should be an ultimate test. Now, when I start brushing, it has loaded the brush of magic. The magic brush is now in effect, and that size is way too big. Let's bring that down. And pray this works. Okay, flow is good, everything else is good. I'm going to start brushing. Turn that on and off. See the color editor again? Whoops, I did not load I did not load that. Let's look at our mistake here. So our mistake was that I didn't load that layer. Let me go to the background and make sure the color editor wasn't done there. So I clicked on the background and did it there, which I was not supposed to do, because if I do that, it does it to the entire background. Okay? So you have to make sure that you have another layer and you don't have the background check before making adjustments. The first step is always add a layer. Layer 1. Okay? The next step is then loading the brush. So I'll go to the color editor, pick my color under the skin tone. I'll pick this like beige arm color because it's pretty nice. Adjust the hue. Let's do it all the way for now. We can change it later. And the saturation. I'll click on my brush, or come here and click on my brush here. The same thing. Make sure your settings are loaded. For now, I'm using a high flow just to quickly bring in the results, but a low flow brings it in slowly. Okay, that's the difference. And then I'm going to start brushing. That's much better. That is the result of champions. There we go. I will do the same maybe for the neck even, for the face. And I'm going to mask out those lips later too. So what did that do? Let me turn this layer on and off. Look at the hand. Just look at the hand. The hand had a whole range of problems. It was desaturated, it was red, it was oh man, I would have had a hard time fixing that in Photoshop. But here it fixes that all for me in one fell swoop. The only thing I need to do now is go back down to my color editor and just chill out with the parameters just a little bit. Maybe bring back some of that natural, some of the redness you'd expect visually, right? I mean, she's not a robot. You don't want it completely off because that brings a lot of redness back. Let's bring it back. So it's trying to bring it back based on the tone we selected here. If I go back and take my color picker and select, say, like the cheek, it's going to change to that cheek color. You see how everything became that cheek color, which is, it might be more favorable than, say, like this or this. So you can go back and decide what color you want later again. I think I'm going to leave it to that cheek color. That was a nice like bronzish tone that applied to the whole skin range. Now, even better is I can come in and then go to my eraser tool, which is going to be E, and I can mask out the areas that I don't want that it corrected. So the lips, basically, just keep that fully red. Some of the rows here, let's erase that. And now we have a great before and after of that color editor with the skin. Let's bring up those parameters just a little bit. There we go. I noticed that the hand is a little bit darker than I want it to be. I want it to be the exposure of the right hand side for balance. So I'm going to add another layer for exposure. Up, and there I will go to my exposure tab, bring it up just a little bit like this, go to my brush, and this time I will change my flow low because I want to do it very gently and quickly. I'm going to go in and add some exposure, and there we go. We added some exposure to the bottom, to the top. And with this on or off, you can see the exposure coming back in the arm just enough. You can bring it back more if you wanted to. And you can even add contouring, so you can dodge and burn essentially. at a global level. So I can say, you know what, let's add more shadows and highlights. So I can add more highlights to the dress over here. So I'm just brushing the exposure up and really getting that out there. I can add more exposure at the bottom. I can then bring up more exposure to some of this foliage here globally. If I decide that's pretty cool, I can go further, add another layer, going burn or exposure down, whatever you want to call it. Drop my exposure here. Same brush settings, I will go in and darken some of this grass that I don't want attention to. And it's working. If you want to brush outside the canvas, start by clicking inside of it and then work your way outside, and then it allows you to brush accordingly on the outside. See? And the last step is I can also add some clarity. So if I feel like I want to add some clarity to just the dress, I can say dress clarity, go to my clarity, bring it up, click on my brush, and then just start brushing. And immediately it adds that nice punch to the dress that is really nice, and the details start accentuating. And if I turn it on and off, you can see that the local contrasting increase. And the same thing goes for whatever your imagination calls for. And then I can combine that with maybe the additional color editing tools, like over, let's see, I can go into my curve. I can say, you know, I want more blues in the shadows, but only in the background. I can say, yeah, let's do that. Let's increase some of the blues here. Actually, no, that increases the blues as well as the clarity. So let's delete that. A new layer. Blue in the shadows. And I can come up here, bring this up here in the shadows, just in the shadows, because it's going to make it very linear, just in the shadows. It's like my brush again. Increase the size, and start by brushing up top. Whoops, that flow was way too high. Let's undo that. Command Z, eraser. I should say brush, but with a lower flow. Let's do like a 3% flow. If you do 0 flow, then nothing's going to happen, so don't ever do 0 flow. And so here we go. I'm adding some blues in the background. And then I'll just go in and drop my brush size and just start painting some of that area in as well. And I could go like, you know what, that's too much. Let's bring that down. Let's just do it overall like this, where there's more blue influence. So I could do that. And go into my greens. I can drop my greens if I want. And you can see the greens will drop to more magenta. That looks really beautiful. I can continue and paint that down here. And at the bottom here. And at the top. And if I want to know where I've painted or not painted, I can say always display mask, and it shows me right here. This is where the Wacom tablet is extremely handy, because you can get the exact area of where you painted and really fine-tune it, because the trackpad is obviously not the best when it comes to that. And then I will continue on in between her. And because you're taking use of the raw processor or the raw data in the file, it makes it really cool to really bring out the colors and take advantage of them. That was not that detailed, but just a good sense of what's happening. Let's erase some of this as well. Then I can even do a really big soft brush and maybe do like a halo so that not everything is more magenta, it's just around the ends. So you can draw a mask. I forgot the grass. Let's do the grass. I'm getting really into this picture because it's so gorgeous. I love the fact that you can tweak colors so vividly. Maybe mix some magenta and greens because that is a lot. And then we can just eraser, do some quick swipes across. And there we go. So let's take a look at some of this layer buildup we've done here. So this is our before. Here we didn't do much. I think we did the actual skin itself. We did the skin color of the arm. We did some exposure of the arm and the surrounding areas. We did some burning, so we got rid of that bright patch of grass. We did some clarity with our dress. And then we started painting a lot of color effects in specific local areas. Now that we talked about the local adjustment brush, let's take a look at a lot of styles and presets Capture One has to offer.